Hello, my name's Brady Robards and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University. This video is a short guide on how to convert a honours-sized dissertation into a journal article. What I want to do in this guide is run through a few steps, the first of which being around whether or not you should undertake this process of converting an honours project, a dissertation, a thesis, depending on what it's called in your department, in your discipline, into a journal article and what the process there involves. Now, this guide shouldn't be seen as exhaustive at all. It should be seen as something to kind of sit in consultation or alongside consultations with senior colleagues, advisors, mentors, close to you, whether that's a supervisor or an examiner or someone who's given you some advice and guidance in your academic endeavours thus far. So yeah, think of it in those terms. Think of it as advice that can kind of sit alongside other consultations you might be having with other people. So as I said, my name's Brady and I put my contact details on the slides here. I'm happy to talk to people that are interested in finding out more information about this or who want some advice. So of course the first thing to think about when you're asking yourself this question is should my honours research be published? How might I go about doing that? So this isn't for everybody, of course. With my own honours students, at the very beginning of the process, I encourage my honours students to think about the value of their research beyond just getting an honours degree, beyond the examination itself, and think about how your honours research might contribute to knowledge more generally. In Australia, an honours degree is a 4th year on top of usually a 3-year undergraduate degree. For a standard kind of degree, it might be a 5th or 6th year, depending on what kind of discipline you're in. But it's usually a sort of pathway, a training into a research career, or training in research skills that will allow you to go into a whole bunch of different career options. For some people, it is a pathway into further postgraduate research, whether that's master's or a PhD, and certainly that's what it was for me. It was a pathway into a PhD, which I completed in 2012 at Griffith University. But for many people, it's a way to skill up in research skills, to apply those skills to a whole range of different areas. So this isn't a guide about what honours is, it's really about what happens at the end of that process and what you might be able to do with that research. But as I said, I do encourage all of my students to think about how the research they do in their honours year might be transferable and might extend beyond the purposes of examination and the degree for them. But by the time you get to the end of your honours thesis, your honours year, you might have a very clear sense of what you want to do, or you might not. Now, if you are interested in going into further research, maybe doing a PhD, then one of the things that you'll be encouraged to do during that PhD or afterwards is to publish your research. And I don't think that if you're undertaking a research project, I don't think that you should be discouraged from thinking about publishing. It's something that I think I encourage all my students to consider. But of course, it's not for everyone. So first of all, you need to figure out, is the work that you've done of a publishable quality? Now, you might get advice from your supervisors or from your examiners on this. Some of them might specifically say you should think about publishing your thesis. And this guide is really for people that have answered that question with a yes. Does your thesis fit into a wider program of study? Have you done an honours project that maybe fits into a bigger research project that your supervisor or supervisors are involved in? And this will help answer your question as well, because you might have started off the year, your honours year or your honours process, with a clear sense of heading in that direction already in terms of publishing. Some other considerations are things like time. So do you have the time to put in to convert what might be a 15 or 18,000 word honours dissertation and cutting that down into a journal article size? It's quite a considerable time investment, and if you're working full time or if you have carer commitments and if you're not interested in further postgraduate study, then maybe you don't have the time. So think about that. Of course, it's not something that needs to happen straight away, straight after you've finished your honours project. but it's certainly something that you should think about carefully within a few months, because of course the longer along you get, the less relevant perhaps your data is, or the less relevant your findings might be for a wider audience. So think about time carefully, and think about the timeliness of your research. The other consideration there that I've already mentioned is around trajectory. So are you thinking about doing further research, whether in a PhD or a master's program, or working for an organization maybe where you will be encouraged in that avenue, in that role, in that career, to publish your research, whether it's in a report format or in a kind of scholarly academic journal article format that we're talking about today. Another thing to consider when you're deciding whether or not you should convert your honours dissertation or thesis into a journal article is whether you have opportunity for collaborations in your immediate area. So would you co-author the article with your supervisors, perhaps with examiners, or perhaps a peer, perhaps someone outside of your immediate department, but someone that you want to collaborate with, for example? Or will you write it as a solo author? Now, there are a whole range of different things to consider here. One point might be that you worked very closely with a supervisor and they helped you design the project. Maybe they even helped you recruit participants or survey respondents, or helped you select text that you analysed in your honours research. And they may have been very involved in the writing as well. So think about those kinds of relationships and talk to your supervisors about that, and get their thoughts and input on that. They may or may not have the time or interest in the research going forward beyond the honours project. One thing to be wary of here, of course, for everyone is to think really clearly about, if you're going to co-author with someone, make sure that you agree on what their contribution will be. It's not enough to just edit it and provide some, general feedback, but a co-author should really be involved, whether it's in the kind of project design and implementation and analysis, or contributing writing directly. And there are different standards at different universities, different conventions around what constitutes a co-authoring relationship. So consider those things carefully and be wary of people who might be looking to exploit your excellent research for their own gains. So if you've answered yes to that question about whether or not you should convert your honours thesis into a journal article, here are some steps you might want to consider and go through. So I'm going to go through these 6 steps here with you today. Hopefully it won't take too long, and help you move through this process. So step 1 would be around identifying a target journal, and I'll give you some advice on that. Step 2 is about deciding on the focus of your particular journal article. Step 3 is around the division of labour. If you have co-authored, or if you're going to co-author with a colleague, a supervisor, or a mentor, then lock down that collaboration. I'll talk about that. Step 4, around cutting, editing, writing. Step 5, around getting feedback on the writing you've done. And then the scary step, step 6, submitting, and then what comes after you submit. So let's go straight into step 1, identifying your target journal. Now, the first thing to think about when you're thinking, where might my research be published, is where is the research that you read published? So one thing that I did early on in my research career is I went through my list of references, both from my honours thesis, and also then later on when I went into my PhD, into the Lit Review list of references, and I started looking at the journals that I tend to read most often and cite from most often. And you might see a pattern there. So sometimes you might use a kind of journal article management system. The program that I use is called Papers, and this is what it looks like here. And it's really kind of like an iTunes for PDFs. And one thing that it allows you to do is actually sort by the source of your articles. So if I skim through these PDFs here that I have, these journal articles that I have, you can start to see really quickly there are kind of clusters of journals that I have lots of articles from. So Continuum, a journal of media and communication studies, for example, is a cultural studies journal in Australia. If I scroll down, First Monday is a internet studies journal, so my research is in social media and how young people use the internet. So First Monday is a great open access online journal that is about the internet. So I have a lot of articles from that journal. I'm in the discipline of sociology as well, so I have a lot of sociology journals. The Journal of Youth Studies is a journal that I cite quite frequently. This is the Journal of Sociology, is the Australian Sociological Association's flagship journal. So this is just one way of getting a sense of where you might think about publishing your work. Now, the next stage after you've looked at your journal articles, where it is that you cite most often, is to do a little bit of research on those individual journals and find out what are the top journals in terms of their impact factor or their H index, and these are measures of citation. And maybe even find out about what their rejection rate is. Do they receive a lot of submissions each year? Or are they more open to postgraduates or to undergraduates even, and thinking about the kinds of ways that those journals frame invitations from scholars. So some other things to think about when you're selecting a journal, a target journal, is things like word length, what the intended audience is, formatting requirements, referencing style, and what or who you should be citing. So in terms of word length, journals can range from shorter articles around 3,000 words. There's a journal that I have published in before called MC Journal, which is a media and communication studies journal, and it's only 3,000 words, so short, really punchy articles that come out very quickly, and the review process is very quick, and it's also open access, so there's lots of advantages there. But it isn't the most highly cited journal, and it doesn't have the biggest impact factor. So it's not as prestigious as some other journals, but it has that really fast turnaround and a very tight kind of focus. Compare that with a journal like New Media and Society, which is one of the top journals in communications and media studies. And it is much more prestigious in lots of ways because of its rankings. It gets cited a lot, but it is a slower process and a longer process in terms of peer review, the time it takes from your initial submission to getting a decision on whether your submission will be accepted or not. And then even when you do get accepted into that journal, it might take some time before your article comes out. So they're the kinds of things to consider when you're thinking about target journals. And New Media and Society is a lot longer, I think 7,000 to 8,000 words, so double that shorter journal article that I spoke about before. So when you're looking at these things, all of these the factors will need to be considered in your selection of a target journal. And preferably it shouldn't just be one journal, because you may get rejected, or they may encourage you to submit your work elsewhere. So I would actually encourage you to come up with a list of target journals. So I've mentioned some of these points already around quality, impact factor, but there are other ways to assess whether or not a journal is the right place for your research. And it might be that a journal like First Monday, for example, might not have the highest impact factor or might not be the most prestigious journal, but many of the scholars whose work that I really enjoy and like publish there. So similarly with some other journals that I've published in, it hasn't always been driven by that prestige factor, or even the open access factor, or even the time it takes a submission to be reviewed. It's also things about where your peers, where the people that you look up to as well, the scholars whose work you follow, where do they publish? So think about those things as well. In terms of getting recommendations from your colleagues around what journals they think you should publish in, certainly take the advice of your supervisors, perhaps early career researchers in your department, or early career researchers who are more junior academics, junior lecturers. They will often have had the experience of going through this process themselves recently, whereas a senior professor might have published in lots of different kinds of journals and will have a reputation and will have a lot of experience and skill in terms of writing journal articles. Early career researchers are only maybe 5 to 10 years ahead of where you're at with your research at the moment, so they might have more kind of current early career research perspectives on thinking about where to target your journal submissions. A tool that I wanted to show you as well, it's a website called AskAMarker. And so AskAMarker is ranking website that allows you to search for different journals and see their rankings in terms of impact factor, the quartile that the SCAMARGO website ranks them in, and so on. So if you type in a journal, one of the ones that you thought about from your target list. So let's say we type in sociology here, which is one of my main disciplines of study. It will spit out a bunch of journals in that field. Now, the American Journal of Sociology and the Annual Review of Sociology are very prestigious, very difficult journals to get into. So you might not want to try for something like that initially. Sociology is the British Sociological Association's flagship journal, and just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that SCAMARGO will tell you about, it'll give you a bit of a sense of the scope, and you can click on the source to go directly to the journal's website. These green indicators here show you where the SCAMARGO website ranks this particular journal in a quartile sense. So sociology is a really top journal, so it's ranked in Q1 currently, the top quartile. So of the four kind of quartile positions, SCAMARGO have put sociology in that top one. You can also see lots of other data here around citations, which a lot of people use as a measure of impact, the extent to which there's international collaboration, and so on. So try searching for a journal that you're thinking about in this website here, and you can get a sense of what kind of impact or how often this journal is cited, and it gives you a little bit of more information to inform your decision making around. So First Monday, for example, whereas that previous journal, Sociology, was only listed in that one discipline, First Monday here is listed in a range of different disciplines. So for computer networks and communication, for human-computer interaction, for law, you can see that it's quartile 2 for those top 2 disciplines and quartile 1 for law. So it also depends on what kind of degree you're in now, what kind of department you're in. Maybe if you want to do a PhD, what department will that be in? What kind of jobs do you want to get in the future, and so on. That will all help inform your decision making here. Your faculty might also have a list of quality publications. So in the School of Social Sciences here at Monash, in the Faculty of Arts, we have a quality list where people have assembled this list of journals and publishers that they deem to be quality. So that might be a consideration as well if you've got a local list like that. Okay, that's step 1. Step 2, deciding on your focus. Now that you know how long your journal article has to be, the referencing style that you're going to use, and all this information is provided by the journal in the information for contributors. Now you have to think about what you get rid of, because some journal articles might be 7,000 to 8,000 words. That's about average. But you might have written a 12 to 18,000 word honours dissertation. So you obviously can't include all of that. You can't just submit your whole thesis. You really need to think about narrowing it down to a particular kind of focus. So many in the social sciences, many honours dissertations have a fairly straightforward structure: introduction, literature review, methodology, findings or discussion, and conclusion. That's a kind of straightforward structure. An honours dissertation will also have a lot of information in it that is about kind of proving your skills, the project design. It will also perhaps include a much broader introduction that proves to an examiner that you've done your homework, basically. In a journal article, you don't need as much of that. In fact, you can't have all of that in a journal article. 7,000 to 8,000 words might seem like a lot, but it's still significantly shorter than most honours-sized dissertations. So where do you focus? Immediately, you can cut down your methodology or your method section and your introduction. Those are the places where you'll lose a lot of words initially. But also in terms of the conclusion and the way you set out your findings and discussion, those will have to be trimmed down significantly. But the core of your journal article has to be your findings and your discussion. So even these sections, though, you probably won't be able to just copy and paste from your dissertation or your thesis into the article. There'll have to be a significant kind of focusing in process that happens there. Similarly, the literature review might need to be completely reframed or at least narrowed down to align with a specific kind of finding. So for example, some of my honours students have had maybe 2 or 3 findings or discussion chapters in their theses, and in the process of deciding what to focus on for a journal article, we really focused on maybe one particular chapter or one key finding that then you support using interview transcripts or extracts from transcripts rather, or particular data from a survey. You can't do it all. It's not about reporting what you've done in that whole honours year. It's really about the contribution to knowledge. So it has to come through the literature review about the gap or the issue that you're identifying and that you're addressing, and then your main focus in the article is about fleshing that out, responding to that. Step 3, as we discussed before, co-authoring can be quite challenging in lots of ways. One of the most effective ways, I think, to work with people productively in this kind of collaborative writing space is to agree early on who will do what. So if you're teaming up with your supervisor to write this journal article, or rather condense down what you've already written into a journal article format, have a really frank discussion, whether it's in person and then followed up by an email to just confirm things so you both have it in writing. It's a really useful process because then you can go back and say, look, this is what we agreed on, and if things aren't working out, maybe you need to adjust that, but at least it's clear from the beginning. So your job, you should be the first named author, certainly, if you're doing the bulk of the work, but a colleague, a supervisor, or a mentor, or perhaps one of your examiners should also be very clear on what their contribution is. So is it to add more material to the literature review to help you with a particular dimension of your analysis? Maybe they're bringing in their own primary research and kind of blending it in with your honours research to kind of make a more compelling or convincing argument. Or maybe it's a kind of pairing between 2 broader projects, and that might be a bigger discussion to have around the author sequence, that who gets named first and so on. So that's my only suggestion there. Each kind of collaboration is very different, but I would encourage you to agree early on who will do what, and divide the labour up as appropriate there. The 4th step is really the bulk of the work. This is around cutting, editing, and sometimes even doing a bit more writing. So as I said before, if a standard honours dissertation or thesis is between 10 and 20,000 words, and you have to cut it down to 6,000 to 8,000 words, if you go for a traditional length journal article, then you've got a lot of work to do in terms of cutting. If you go for one of those much shorter journal articles that I was talking about before, like MC with 3,000 words, then that will even be more work. So coming back to the earlier point on finding your focus, that will really help you determine what to cull. Sometimes it might be even easier to rewrite 3 or 4 paragraphs of your lit review rather than trying to cull down a whole chapter. Same with your methodology. It might be much easier to write that from scratch, summarizing in your own head what you've done rather than trying to edit an existing piece of writing. Sometimes you'll also find that you have to do some more work. So that might involve so for example, an examiner might have given you some feedback about literature that you weren't aware of during your honours project, but now they might have brought it to your attention. You need to go and do some more reading, and that might become a core part of your literature review. Or you might be combining data with another project or with another element of a broader project, so that might require some additional writing as well. This, of course, is very individual depending on your approach and your particular circumstances, but certainly this is where the bulk of the work is. Once you've got a good draft and it meets the requirements of the journal in terms of the word length, the referencing style, the formatting, and so on, and all journals will have very clear instructions on the formatting and those requirements, now it's time to get some feedback. So if you've collaborated with your supervisor, of course they should have been involved in the process of writing and rewriting the dissertation into a journal article, but if not, they might be a good person to get some feedback from as well. Similarly, examiners, maybe lecturers who have been involved in your honours year or in your undergraduate studies previously, they might be open to providing some feedback on your journal article. You might also want to reach out to some experts in your field. So whether it's people that you've cited before or people whose work you've read, they might also be able to provide feedback. Now, of course, most academics are very, very busy, so don't be upset if they say, no, I'm sorry that I can't, but it's worth asking sometimes to get some feedback. It also is worth sometimes talking to people who aren't perhaps subject matter experts, but might have been involved in editing a journal before, or they might have done some reviewing for journal articles. They might be peer reviewers. Most academics are asked and invited to review journal articles through the blind kind of review process. So many academics will be able to provide you some generalist feedback on structure and whether your argument is clear and sound, and provide you some more detached kind of feedback in that way. And then, of course, the scary bit, submitting it. So once you've found your journal, you've written it, and you go through usually it's an online submission process, then you have to wait. Sometimes it can be a long wait, hopefully not too long. If it's more than a few months, you might want to ask some colleagues who have maybe published in that journal when you should start asking editors or the managing editor usually, whether there's any updates. But once you get the decision back, hopefully it's quickly, within a few months, then you can go forward. Now, of course, you need to prepare yourself for rejection. An unfortunate part of academic life is that we often get rejected. So, and sometimes it's not a comment on the quality of your work. It might just be that your journal article was not within the scope of that journal. Hopefully, if you've done your homework and if you know very well what kind of research that journal publishes, this won't be an issue for you. But sometimes that is a decision that they come back with. Some common kinds of outcomes from the review process are things like accept, which is really exceptional, and if your article gets accepted straight off the bat, that's fantastic. It's never happened to me, sadly, but that would be a great outcome. The more common ones are things like being accepted with minor revisions, so that might be just a few adjustments here and there. Major revisions is also quite common though, so this might be where the reviewers have suggested you do some additional reading, or you reframe some analysis, or maybe even that you go in a completely different direction. Now, major revisions can also be a huge spectrum that might seem like small on one end, but then might actually be quite major on the other. So get help interpreting the feedback that you've received. And this is another advantage of collaborating with a supervisor or an examiner, is that they can actually help you interpret the feedback from reviewers, and there's a whole art in that itself. Some things that, if revisions are sought, you might want to think about are distilling the comments from the reviewers into a table. So usually what happens when you get your reviews back is that there'll be usually at least 2 reviewers, but you might have more. There might be 3 or 4 reviews that come back to you. Hopefully they're all reasonably aligned, but sometimes you'll get reviews that completely disagree with each other. You might get reviewer 1 who says it's great, publish it as is, and you might get reviewer 2 who has a really long list of changes they want you to make before they will recommend it be published. Sometimes you'll also get editors who will provide their own editorial feedback, and this might be in the form of directing you to specific points that the reviewers have identified that the editors want you to address, or it might be separate kinds of revisions that the reviewers themselves haven't addressed. So one thing I find helpful at this point, once I've got revisions back, is to distill those comments into a table, where on the left-hand side, I'll summarize each point that the reviewers or the editors have made, and on the right side of the table, I'll put down how I've addressed or responded to those points. And that's also a really useful thing to then send to the editors once you've made the revisions and you're resubmitting the article, because they can then clearly see what you've done and how you've responded to individual points of feedback. I would also encourage you to think about linking your comments, your responses in the right-hand column to specific page numbers within the journal article, so that the editors can quickly see exactly where you've made those changes to. You will also need to check to see whether the editors of the journal want you to track the changes that you've made. Some of them like you to, in Microsoft Word, to track the changes. Others prefer clean resubmissions, but with very clear evidence as to where you've made those specific changes that have been requested. The other thing to do here is to resubmit as soon as possible. If you've been asked to revise your journal article, don't leave it for too long. Obviously take a bit of time to process the changes, especially if they're significant. Try not to take it too personally and try to move on as quickly as possible, because the longer you leave it, the more likely it is that your data or your findings, your discussion will become dated. But also it can be really difficult to get back into it if you've left a long time between the first submission and redoing your revisions, addressing the revisions. So if you do get rejected though, if you don't get accepted with either minor or major revisions or no revisions at all, if you do get outright rejected, then that's okay, and that's normal. Lots of people get rejected. Get advice. Sometimes the editors themselves will give you a suggestion on where to take your journal article next, or it might simply be up to you to go and get some advice from colleagues, and that might be your supervisors or other senior people in your department or other mentors. But if you put the work in and if you think it's worth doing, and if your colleagues, your mentors are suggesting you to continue on, then do resubmit as soon as you can. Sometimes you might get rejected, but you still might get feedback from reviewers. And if that's the case, and if you think that feedback is useful to improve your article moving forward, then that's great feedback to take on as well. Okay, so that's it. I hope this has been useful, and good luck with your research, and good luck with submitting your journal articles. It's a really challenging process, but also really rewarding. And think about your research as having a value and impact beyond your honours project. And also think about, in the future, honours students or undergraduate students reading your research in a journal article and citing your research one day. It's a very rewarding process and helps connect you to a much bigger area of scholarship that might also be beneficial if you go on to do a PhD or if you want to pursue a career in academia. So all the best and good luck, and do feel free to get in touch. My email address is there, brady.robards@monash.edu, and you can also find me on Twitter @BradyJ. So good luck and all the best.